Bonjour, je m'appelle Pamela King. Je suis honorée de parler avec vous sur un sujet qui me passionne. J'aurais aimé parler plus français, mais je ne le fais pas. Donc, je parlerai en anglais. Merci. Despite that I don't speak much French, I am very honored to be speaking with you all about a subject that I care deeply about. I am thrilled to hear that the Department of Justice in France is interested in having professionals who work with young people be more versed in spirituality, which is a very crucial and often overlooked asset for young people today. So I hope to begin to share with you some of my knowledge based on my research in the last 20 years. I am sure that for you all as professionals who work with youth, that it is not a shock that we are finding such high levels of anxiety, depression, and other mental health systems in youth today. To me, it is not a surprise as our world and our cultures continually radically change. I can speak very specifically to the context of the United States, where many of our conventional civic, social, and religious institutions that have served to weave together the social fabric of society are eroding. This was happening before the COVID-19 pandemic, but has only been accelerated by the need to physically distance, which has often led to social distance and loneliness. But even before COVID, digital platforms like Snapchat, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook have begun to replace people's alliance to actual in-person organizations. And this is especially true for our younger people. And this shift is causing youth who are coming of age in networks to grow differently than they used to. When people are a part of more digital networks that are often lacking honesty, clear beliefs, authentic intimacy, accountability, rituals, and psychologically formative practices, youth are not being formed in ways that they were historically. They are not being given the identity capital. They are not having opportunities for belonging, and they are not being guided in many of the pro-social attitudes and behaviors that at least our country and our democracy has depended on. So we're at a time when youth are being raised without many of the psychological resources that they need to effectively navigate the transition from adolescence to adulthood. It's not surprising. They are being raised with many competing narratives. Media, global exposures offered exposes kids to a cacophony of narratives and beliefs and values. They are also being raised without a secure sense of belonging and often lack the experience of being known and really mattering. For some, even in their families, and for many, many youth outside of their families. So this lack of grounding and connection to ideals, to something beyond the self, and even to people pose real challenges for young people today in establishing identity, meaning, and purpose, all of which are really important developmental endeavors in adolescence. So today I want to share a bit about my work in the realm of youth spirituality and talk with you how, even with these challenges in contemporary life, or especially with these challenges in contemporary life, that spirituality can be an extraordinary resource for young people. And in addition, I'd like to point out that it is often an overlooked resource for young people. As statistics reveal, people are less engaged in traditional social resources or institutions of spirituality, which have often been religious congregations. Religion has generally been ostracized from school settings, at least public school settings, and often from public services. So professionals in education and in youth services often are not equipped or trained to deal with issues of spirituality. Historically, that's been on purpose, and I'm so excited to see that there is a corrective. I see it a lot in the United States, and excited to hear that there is interest in France. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I am a professor of applied developmental science, or in other words, I'm a developmental psychologist that is very interested in how psychology is applied to real youth in real settings. I am also the executive director of the Thrive Center for Human Development, which is a center that is committed to enabling all people, all diverse persons to thrive. In the last 20 years, the two areas that my research has mainly focused on has one I will characterize as positive youth development, or thriving. Positive youth development is a movement that emerged based out of youth practitioners in the United States that really focused on what can go right with young people rather than what can go wrong with young people. Most of the mental health practitioners in the United States, whether youth or adult serving, are informed by a mental health model that really is based on the identification of pathology, and again, focuses on what can go wrong with people rather than promoting what can go right with people. So the positive youth development movement has championed a concept we refer to thriving as thriving. Thriving is a strength-based orientation. We look at youth as resources to be developed, not as problems to be managed. Positive youth development and thriving both have very strong systems orientations. So we're always looking at young people in the context in which they live. So whether that's their family context, their school, their socioeconomics, the politics, or their congregations or other youth programs that they might have access to. We're always looking how to elevate the resources ecologically around them to promote and build on the strengths of youth. The other area of research that I have really focused on is what we are speaking on today, which is spirituality. I have looked both at how the nature and the function of spirituality in youth. So looking at how does spirituality develop in young people and identifying the different psychological capacities that are necessary for spirituality and how they grow and how they change in adolescence and childhood. And then also, how does spirituality function for young people? Are there benefits to being a spiritual person, to growing in spiritual capacities, to participating in spiritual communities or spiritual practices? So it is the latter that we are going to speak on today. I'll also just note that if topics come up that are of more interest to you, the Thrive Center does have an informational website, www.thethrivecenter.org, where you can find downloadable PDFs, references, and further discussion of some of the points that I want to be making with you today. So I want to argue or suggest, and actually I don't even need to argue, there is a lot of empirical research that demonstrates that youth who are engaged in both religion and spirituality are generally more resourced and have more positive developmental outcomes, like academic grades, staying in school, higher sense of purpose, more civic contribution, more pro-social identity, stronger sense of identity. They report higher levels of life satisfaction than those with less amounts of religious engagement or valuing engaging in spirituality. So, but what I want to unpack with you today is and share with you a framework that I use to help guide people to understand the psychological resources that are naturally embedded within spirituality that can be so helpful for young people. And today, I really want to focus on helping convey how spirituality can really help youth navigate the very challenging and turbulent waters that our world presents them with today. And as we know, adolescents, their brains are under construction, and those synapses are not always firing as consistently as in adulthood. So there really are challenges that youth have just from a developmental standpoint as they are growing in their sense of identity, understanding to whom they belong and what they stand for. And in our world's constantly changing milieu, not to mention just COVID updates, but just all the radical shifts, changes in institutions and organizations and values, and various trends, I want to talk about how religion and spirituality can really help play an integral role in youth developing a sense of identity and purpose, and just help them generally in their development. So in the conversation today, I want to think with you not just about religion and religious traditions, but I want to think with you about spirituality as an engagement with transcendence. And by transcendence, I'm referring to some perception of greater reality beyond the mundane and beyond oneself. And whatever that is, whether that is God, Allah, science, a sense of truth, a sense of unity of all humanity, whatever that is, it is profound enough that it prompts and can sustain attitudinal and behavioral changes that are central to both resilience and thriving in young people. I'll talk a little bit more about that. So let's just define terms real quickly. When I speak of religiosity or religion, I am referring to the specific beliefs and doctrines, the community, the practices, and the rituals that are associated with religious traditions. Spirituality is often experienced within the context of religion, but it does not have to. So I'm going to refer to spirituality as one's experience of and their response to one's perception of transcendence. So I want to say that again. So from my perspective, and this is actually based on quite extensive research with diverse youth around the world, spirituality refers to one's experience of transcendence and also their response to it. So from my perspective, spirituality is not just a feeling of being connected to some greater entity, whether supernatural or not, whether it is a sense of even patriotism for the country of France, or someone's favorite political party or sports team. But transcendence also, or spirituality, forgive me, spirituality involves one's response to that experience or perception of transcendence. So spirituality or spiritual development occurs when young people experience something bigger than themselves, and their sense of self, their identity, and their worldview, the way they perceive the world, is actually changed. So if this helps, from a psychological perspective, people experience transcendence through their thoughts and their cognitions, through their feelings, their affect and emotions, and often through their senses. Neuroscientists or neuropsychologists will talk about the peripheral nervous system, that people often sense that there is something bigger than themselves. We don't have a clear science at this point to completely describe that. And there's a high level of mystery, but I think that actually adds a bit to the power and influence of spirituality. There is something about something that is beyond our understanding that is very influential to us. So just real quick, a couple of examples of the type of transcendence or spirituality that I'm talking about is that a Muslim youth might experience transcendence when they engage in salat, in prayer, the experience of unity of other Muslims bowing and praying towards Mecca will give them an embodied experience of being connected to a population, a world beyond themselves, and a connection to Allah. For others, nature often heightens our senses, gives us an experience of awe and possibly the emotion of elevation that moves us beyond ourselves, that makes us more highly aware of the world around us, and actually can give us an awareness of ourself and our place in that. So experiencing transcendence occurs when one's awareness and focus is shifted from oneself in the mundane towards a bigger or greater reality that provides a more expansive perspective on life and actually provides meaning in life. So I want to think with you about a specific framework that I use to think about the different resources within spirituality. I'm going to highlight three different contexts, three different aspects of spirituality. None of these are absolutely distinct and there's overlap, but I have found this a helpful way to enable people to identify the various resources within spirituality. And just so you know, I'm coming at this presentation from the vantage that you are professionals who work with young people who are trying to enable them to thrive, to become their best selves, to develop their strengths with others and for others. So when I think about thriving, I'm talking about not just a young person being happy or successful or even having reporting high levels of life satisfaction, but I am talking about a young person who can live ever more deeply into who they are, discovering and cultivating their strengths with others and for others. So for a purpose beyond themselves. A thriving life is a life that is not self-focused, but a life that is activated for the greater good. So I want to talk about spirituality in the context of enabling people to thrive, to understand who they are, to live more deeply in relationship with others, and to aspire and pursue their ideals and values and live a life that contributes beyond themselves. So the three major resources I point to within spirituality that is helpful to promote this kind of thriving are the ideological resources. There's a very strong ideological context in spirituality. The social context, that is the relationships, And also the transcendent context, the context that is very beyond the self and that often points to a reality bigger than our daily lives. So from the perspective of the ideological context, spirituality exposes young people to existential beliefs, morals, informs what matters, what's important, what is of value, and very importantly, often provides a narrative, a story about what is important in the world, that youth can locate themselves in it. Religious traditions, because they have sacred texts and doctrines, often have more clear set of beliefs or a more clear narrative about the origins of the world, the purpose of life, etc. Where spiritual traditions, sometimes more or less, have a clear narrative or clear beliefs. But spiritual practices often put young people in touch with considering and contemplating and reflecting on what matters to them. So when working with young people, an important way to activate these ideological resources within spirituality is to help kids consider what matters. What's the story they tell their life? How does that story about who they are weave them in or not to a greater story? Research shows that when we find our lives as part of a bigger story that's bigger than our life, we have a greater sense of purpose. So whether in your own one-on-one work or programmatic work with youth, you are encouraging and offering opportunities for young people to reflect on beliefs and their morals and their values. You can also point them and refer them to apps or other spiritual communities that might engage them in considering their beliefs. Some young people come into our lives with a spiritual tradition. Some come with a political tradition. Whatever you can, help kids get clear about what guides their life, what gives their life meaning and purpose and coherence. And please let them know that this is always going to be refined, that it's important to question, it's important to doubt, but it's important to reflect and pursue these things. So in addition to an ideological context, spirituality usually offers a social context. Usually with spirituality comes a community or a group of persons who exemplify the principles or embody the values or the moral examples of how one should live. Spiritual communities provide examples of people who have wrestled with the deep questions of life, who have struggled and at times excelled or been challenged and have overcome and been resilient at pursuing their goals and purposes. These examples are so important for young people. So again, activating spiritual resources for young people needs to include engaging people with a sense of belonging in a community where they can be known and loved and affirmed that they matter, where their strengths and their passions and their sparks can be affirmed. And if that doesn't happen, again, in your direct work with young people, referring youth or encouraging them to be engaged in a community where they are deeply known and loved is extremely important. Often spiritual communities and religious communities provide opportunities for leadership and service. These are tremendously formative for youth, helping them discover their strengths, construct identity, and also clarify and then pursue their purpose. So getting kids engaged in a place where they can see people in action, be engaged with caring adults, and have actual experiences, pursuing purpose, and testing out their beliefs are extremely important. Lastly, and perhaps most unique to spirituality, is what I would refer to as a transcendent context. That spirituality, by definition, engages people in a reality beyond themselves. And having this experience of transcendence is extraordinarily important. As I started to say, when youth are exposed to a story, to a reality, to a group of people that is bigger than them, it not only provides them with a very important sense of identity, but it also provides them with perspective. That their crisis of the day, how many friends they have, or how many likes on Instagram, what people are wearing, even the trouble they may be in, if they're engaged in juvenile law, is not the end of their lives. Spirituality offers a much broader horizon that can provide hope for young people. It can also be overwhelming. So we need the beliefs and we need the social support. And we also need spiritual practices to help young people be able to see into the future with hope and with ever-growing clarity. So within this transcendence context, I also want to talk about the importance of spiritual practices. We're in a world today, at least in the United States, where mindfulness practices and meditation are increasingly popular. There are numerous apps that allow young people or older people like us to easily be guided in spiritual practices, practices that help regulate us, that calm our nervous systems, that help us gain clarity and awareness about who we are, about our needs, about our desires, about our hopes and aspirations. In a world today when kids are bombarded by constant notifications on their phone, notifications and messaging that has wildly different messages, helping young people increase their capacity to regulate, to be mindful, to be both self-aware and other-aware is extremely important. In addition to practices that may come from religious traditions or may come from psychological practices or apps that help regulate us, these practices can also cultivate compassion and empathy. Practices that help us or guide us in imagining other people's experiences or other people's perspective have been demonstrated to grow compassion and pro-social attitudes and behavior in young people. And lastly, we need practices that not just regulate us and calm us, offer us other people's perspective, but practices that elevate us, that get those dopamine circuits and oxytocin flowing, are so helpful for motivating young people. These can be, these are often communal practices, whether traditional singing, worship, other embodied practices of yoga. Different poses can calm us. Different poses can elevate us. Being exposed to beauty, art, nature can inspire and elevate us. This helps motivate us. The Science of Flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi also gives great insight into practices that can give us a sense of burgeoning positive emotions that can motivate us to pursue those things that matter. So in summary, spirituality is full of great resources. I summarize them by thinking about the ideological resources, the beliefs and the narrative, the communities, the relationships that can guide people and give examples, and also the practices that keep people in touch with what matters and with the people around them and those sources of ultimacy. I'm just going to close by saying, when I was younger, my brothers and I used to play a game called Battleship. I'm hoping you have this in France, but Battleship was a game where you had a board, kind of like a laptop, and you placed ships on your grid, and the other person couldn't see it, and they placed their ships. And there was a coordinate system, letters across the top, numbers on the side, and you would try and guess where other people's ships were located, and they would try and guess where your ships were located. So you would call, excuse me, you would call out coordinates like B6 or I9, trying to locate their ships, and they would do the same thing. Today, young people are really lacking clear coordinates to locate themselves. Instagram offers thousands of different sets of coordinates. COVID keeps changing our coordinates. I get email updates daily from my children's different schools about COVID guidelines. I'm talking about life guidelines. Spirituality helps kids navigate by directing them towards coordinates. At a certain age, kids need to be given coordinates. They need to be offered beliefs. They need to be offered a narrative. As they mature into adolescence, they really need to question those coordinates and really refine their own set of coordinates. But as people who work with adults, the more we can help guide people, young people, towards identifying their coordinates of what matters, of what brings purpose, of what is right and wrong, the more chances they have to thrive. The more we can direct people towards caring relationships and community and belonging, where they can see lives of purpose, where they can gain support in being guided towards their coordinates, they will thrive. And lastly, the more practices that young people have that regulate them and help them get in touch with their coordinates, that help them realize how off or on target they are towards where they're headed. And the more practices that can help motivate to pursuing those coordinates, the more likely they will thrive. There are a lot of resources for young people that can offer coordinates, communities, and practices that can even give a sense of transcendence. But it's very rare that all three areas are activated, and spirituality is key for that. So my hope as people who care for and guide young people, that as you go into this new year, not only will you have a renewed sense of spirituality, however you understand transcendence, but that you would have a renewed sense of the coordinates in your life, of what matters and what you value, of people who support you in the journey of pursuing that direction, and that you would have a clear set of practices that keep you in touch and fuel you as you pursue that direction. And of course, my deepest hope is that that experience of spirituality, of thriving in your own life, would be contagious and inform how you guide youth, either directly into spirituality or outside of your time with them, that you are more fully equipped to encourage them to pursue beliefs in mattering, communities and practices that will not only help them be resilient and bounce back in the face of suffering and mistakes and challenges, but that will also enable them to thrive and understand their extraordinary worth, dignity, and mattering, their strengths, and how those strengths can be used for the greater good. Thank you. Merci beaucoup. I am inspired to know that there is a whole group of people in France that are committed to enabling young people to thrive. Best wishes in your journey. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.